Several years ago, I was on a road trip with my family when all of a sudden the brake line ruptured. Fortunately, I had a flare nut wrench which saved the day. So the question is that $15 set of wrenches just as good as the one that cost $285? Well, let's find out. In the first test, we'll see which wrench performs the best on a brake line fitting. Then we'll see if a regular open-end wrench can outperform the half and the 5/8 inch flare nut wrenches. A flare nut wrench can really come in handy when a box end is not an option. Hydraulic couplers such as brake and power steering fittings can be very soft. So compared to an open-end wrench, a flare nut offers more points of contact to loosen or tighten fittings. At a price of only $10, the least expensive set of wrenches we'll be testing is made by Efficere. To help you work in tight spaces, the wrenches have a 15-degree angled offset. The sizes include 3/8, 7/16, 1/2, 9/16, 5/8, and 11/16. The Efficere brand is made in China. Let's go ahead and weigh the most common size wrench, the 1/2, 9/16. Weight can sometimes be an indicator of quality, and the Efficere weighs 102 grams. If you're trying to work within a tight space, head size can be a huge factor. And the Efficere has a pretty big head at 0.855 inches. I purchased a whole bunch of brake line fittings to compare the performance of all the size 3/8 inch wrenches. And the size of the fittings is 0.3735 inches, which is just under 3/8 of an inch. I've secured the fitting in a vise, and I'll be using a dial indicator to measure the amount of slop or back and forth movement on the fastener. And a sloppy wrench makes working within a tight space more challenging. After all, it's going to need a lot more back and forth movement to begin loosening or tightening the fitting. Too much slop is going to probably cause some damage or round off the fitting. And at 4.5 inches, the Efficere has a lot of slop at almost 3/4 of an inch. Using a highly accurate Proto torque wrench calibration tester, let's compare the performance of each wrench. I'll replace the fitting between testing each wrench. Let's first see how a regular open-ended wrench made by GearWrench performs. And the GearWrench rounded the 3/8 inch fitting at 144.3 inch-pounds. And the GearWrench completely wrecked the fitting. Let's see how the open end of a snap-on flank drive performs. And the snap-on finally slipped at 209.4 inch-pounds, or about 65 inch-pounds more than the GearWrench. Omnivores and carnivores are very common, but the snap-on is definitely a metalivore with some leftovers on his teeth. Now that's a lot of damage. Let's see if the Efficere can beat the good wrench at snap-on. And the Efficere slipped at 188.2 inch-pounds, or about 20 inch-pounds less than the open end of the snap-on wrench. The Efficere has a lot more taper, which reduces the contact area on the fitting. At a bargain price of only $12 is this Duratech brand. Just like the Efficere, the Duratech includes 3 wrenches in 6 different sizes, made of polished drop-forged alloy steel. The Duratech is made in China. And the Duratech weighs 94 grams. And the Duratech has a larger head than the Efficere at 0.874 inches, and it also has a much better fit at only 0.598 inches. So logically, the Duratech should outperform the Efficere. And it took a couple of attempts to fully tighten the fitting. And the Duratech did indeed outperform the Efficere at 194.7 inch-pounds. With less taper, the Duratech would have performed even better. If it's all about performance and price, should you buy the Performance Tool brand for a price of $13? It claims to have a professional full pattern raised panel design. The 3 wrenches include sizes 3/8 to 11/16. The wrenches do not include a brand marking, so I'll go ahead and add PT for Performance Tool. The Performance Tool brand is made in China. Performance Tool weighs right at 100 grams. And the Performance Tool has about a 10% smaller head size than the Duratech at only 0.794 inches. And the Performance Tool is really struggling with performance, as it has more slop than the dial indicator can handle at well over an inch. Check out the fit of the Performance Tool wrench. Now that's a pretty loose fit. It takes at least 60 inch-pounds to excite the tester, and the Performance Tool gave up before 60 inch-pounds. A very poorly designed wrench with this much taper. At a price of $16 is this Crescent brand, sizes 3/8 to 11/16. The Crescent wrenches are made in India, and the Crescent's the heaviest yet at 116 grams. And the Crescent has the most compact head yet at 0.774 inches. And the Crescent also has the least amount of slop yet at 0.577 inches. And the Crescent has the least amount of slop yet, but it has a size disadvantage compared to the Efficere and the Duratech. And the Crescent moves into the lead at 196.3 inch-pounds. The Crescent has very little taper, which really helps. It made contact with about 90% of the fitting. At a price of $20 is this Kobalt brand, sizes 3/8 to 11/16. And the Kobalt wrenches have quite a bit of taper, which will probably hurt performance. The Kobalt wrenches are made in China, and the Kobalt weighs right at 100 grams. And the Kobalt has a pretty big head at 0.8795 inches, and it offers a pretty good fit at 0.61 inches. When it comes to strength, size matters, and the Kobalt's head is massive. And the Kobalt is the first flare nut wrench to outperform the open end on the flank drive snap-on at 247 37.3 inch-pounds. Very impressive. And the Kobalt was able to gain a grip on most of the fitting. At a price of $25 for 5 wrenches, or $5 each, is this Craftsman brand. Includes sizes 1/4 to 7/8 inch. The Craftsman wrenches are made in Taiwan. And the Craftsman is very light at 90 grams. And the Craftsman head is a little bit large at 0.8335 inches. It's pretty similar to the Kobalt at 0.585 inches of slop. And the Craftsman has a pretty large head and the amount of slop isn't too bad. However, the Craftsman gave up very early at under 95 inch-pounds. And the Craftsman has way too much taper and it's only making contact with around 60% of the fitting. At a price of $37 is this Williams brand. Williams claims that their wrenches will not mar fittings on pipes and tubing. Satin chrome textured finish provides great feel and extra gripping power. The Williams wrenches are made in Taiwan. And the Williams weighs 92 grams. And the Williams has a pretty big head at 0.838 inches and a pretty snug fit at 0.534 inches. Size really helps when it comes to wrench strength, and the Williams should perform very well. And 246.6 inch-pounds is very good and close to the same as the Kobalt. And with even less taper, the Williams would have performed even better. At a price of $45 for 5 wrenches, or $9 each, is this Quinn brand, which is sold at Harbor Freight. 15-degree offset for easy clearance. The sizes are from 1/4 inch to 13/16. The Quinn wrenches are made in Taiwan. And the Quinn weighs 94 grams. And the Harbor Freight Quinn is almost the same as the Williams at 0.8375 inches. However, the Quinn has more slop than the Williams at 0.602 inches. And the Quinn is about the same size as the Williams, but unfortunately the Quinn has quite a bit of slop. And the Quinn still performed well at 219.3 inch-pounds. And the Quinn could have performed even better with less taper. At a price of $45 for 6 wrenches, or $8 each, is this GearWrench brand. Designed for use on hex nuts made of softer materials. It includes a 15-degree offset for better access in tight spaces. The GearWrench brand is made in China. And the GearWrench is heavier than average at 110 grams. And the GearWrench is quite a bit more compact than the Williams and the Quinn at 0.7865 inches. Unfortunately, the GearWrench also has a pretty sloppy fit at 0.766 inches. And the GearWrench has way too much slop in order to compete with the Williams and the Quinn. However, 196 inch-pounds is still pretty decent. And the GearWrench has less taper than most of the other brands, but it has way too much slop and it really hurt it. At a price of $46 for 4 wrenches, or about $12 per wrench, is this Milwaukee brand. Both sides of the wrench mention the brand and bright red numbers. This thing definitely deserves some style points. The Milwaukee wrenches are made in China. And it's 110 grams for the Milwaukee. And the Milwaukee is more compact than average at 0.778 inches, and it's a pretty snug fit at 0.542 inches. And the fancy styling with the Milwaukee wasn't enough to impress the torque meter at only 191.5 inch-pounds. At a price of $72 for 4 wrenches, or $18 each, is this Matco Tools brand. The Matco Tools wrenches are made in Taiwan. Matco Tools claims that their 270 degrees of engagement with radius corners are perfect for soft flare nuts and line fittings. And the Matco weighs 118 grams. And the Matco Tools has the most compact head yet at 0.768 inches. It offers the tightest fit yet at only 0.516 inches of slop. And the Matco Tools wrench has the smallest head size yet. And the wrench let go at 188.2 inch-pounds, the same as the Efficere. And there's just way too much taper to gain a good grip. At a price of $75 for 3 wrenches, or $25 each, is this Proto brand. The flare nut box ends incorporate the Torque Plus system. The Proto wrenches are made in USA. And it's 122 grams for the Proto. And the Proto is a little bit larger than the Matco at 0.7855 inches. It also has a nice and snug fit at only 0.533 inches. We're using the Proto tester with a Proto wrench. And the Proto tester is very impressed with the Proto wrench at 289.6 inch-pounds. Very impressive. And the textured finish on the wrench really seemed to help the Proto. At a price of $250 for 5 wrenches, or $50 per wrench, is this Matco Tools brand. 270-degree wraparound on box end allows torque to be transmitted on 5 sides to prevent faster distortion. The wrenches have a crowned handle edge for more comfortable grip. The Matco Tools is made in USA. And the Matco Tools is by far the heaviest at 138 grams. And the Matco Tools is the most compact wrench yet at only 0.749 inches. Unfortunately, it has a pretty sloppy fit at 0.639 inches. And the Matco Tools really struggled on this test at 145.9 inch-pounds. Unfortunately, the Mac has just way too much taper and way too much slop to compete with the best in the showdown. And the most expensive brand we'll be testing is the Snap-on brand, which sells for $285 for 5 wrenches. Snap-on claims that their flank drive system offers 15 to 20% more turning power. Sizes include 1/4 to 13/16. And most of the wrenches have a 15-degree offset. The Snap-on has a 10%. The Snap-on wrenches are made in USA. And the Snap-on is heavier than average at 112 grams. And the Snap-on is even more compact than the Matco Tools at 0.7335 inches. It also has the best fit yet at only 0.465 inches of movement. Very impressive. After the first pass, the Snap-on is still not finished. And the Snap-on has by far the least amount of slop, and that really helped it on this test at 271.5 inch-pounds to move into second place behind the Proto. And the Snap-on is a very well-designed wrench with very little taper. It was able to gain a grip on just about the entire contact area of the fitting. So the Proto wrench came out on top with a very impressive 289.6 inch-pounds. The much more compact Snap-on finished in second at 271.5, and Kobalt and Williams also performed well at close to 250 inch-pounds. Let's move on to the half-inch wrench size, and this time, let's allow the entire jaw of the wrench to gain a grip on this very soft coupling nut. Let's see how the open end of the GearWrench combination wrench performs before we test the flare nut wrenches. And the GearWrench made it to just over 566 inch-pounds or 47 foot-pounds before giving up. Using calipers under a microscope, I measured the width of the damaged area, and the GearWrench carved a 5.09 millimeter path in the very soft metal. And the Snap-on flank drive wrench outperformed most of the flare nut wrenches in the last test. And the Snap-on finally gave up at 760 inch-pounds, which is almost 200 inch-pounds more than the GearWrench. Let's try the Snap-on again to see if it lost any ground. I'll rotate the coupling nut 180 degrees so that the wrench can go to work on the undamaged part of the nut. And the Snap-on performed even better on the second attempt at almost 780 inch-pounds. Very impressive. And the Snap-on carved out a 6.3 millimeter notch in the coupling nut, or 1.3 millimeters wider than the GearWrench. And it didn't take long before the jaw on the Efficere began to stretch and bend. And 710 inch-pounds is less than the Snap-on flank drive wrench. Let's see how much damage we did to the wrench on the first attempt. Unfortunately, the Efficere lost over 200 inch-pounds of strength on the second attempt at 506 inch-pounds. And the Efficere carved a wider path, but the extra width wasn't enough to beat the Snap-on. And the Duratech outperformed the Efficere on the first round of competition, but not this time at 668.3 inch-pounds. And the Duratech didn't lose nearly as much ground on the second attempt as the Efficere at 622.4 inch-pounds. And the Duratech's path of destruction measured 8.02 millimeters. And the Performance Tool outperformed the Efficere and the Duratech at 836 inch-pounds on the first attempt, but the jaw did experience quite a bit of stretch. And the Performance Tool only made it to 688.8 inch-pounds on the second attempt. And the Performance Tool wrench has the widest jaws yet at 8.41 millimeters, which seems to have helped. And the Crescent performed about the same as the Performance Tool on the first attempt at just over 829 inch-pounds. And the Crescent experienced about the same amount of performance loss as the Performance Tool on the second attempt at just over 688 inch-pounds of performance. And the jaw on the Crescent is the widest yet at 9.01 millimeters. And the Kobalt performed very well on the first round on the 3/8 inch fitting, but it really struggled this time at 691.4 inch-pounds on the first attempt. And the Kobalt didn't experience nearly as much performance loss on the second attempt at 606.8 inch-pounds. And the Kobalt has the narrowest jaw yet at 7.23 millimeters, which seems to have really hurt its performance. And the Craftsman once again threw in the towel early and definitely does not want to be in the starting lineup. 477.2 inch-pounds. Even with the bench warmer performance in the first attempt, the Craftsman experienced a season-ending injury in the second attempt at 386.6 inch-pounds. At 8.29 millimeters, there's plenty of jaw contact area, but the jaws are simply too weak to work effectively. And the Williams had a starting lineup performance in the first round. And the Williams once again performed very well at 848.3 inch-pounds to move into the lead. And the Williams showed some pretty impressive grit, spitting out some steel as it logged the best second attempt performance yet at 755.3 inch-pounds. Very impressive. That's only a performance drop of 11%. And the Williams has a pretty wide jaw at 8.3 millimeters, which seems to have really helped it. And the Harbor Freight Quinn put together a bench warmer performance on the first attempt at 559.8 inch-pounds. And 401.3 inch-pounds is a 28.3% performance drop compared to the first attempt. The Quinn left a pretty narrow path of damage at only 7.8 millimeters. And the GearWrench performed about the same as a $3 Efficere wrench on the first attempt at 698.4 inch-pounds. However, the GearWrench held up a lot better than the Efficere on the second attempt. And 652.1 inch-pounds on the second attempt is only a 6.6% performance drop. The GearWrench carved out a pretty narrow 7.53 millimeter path. And the Milwaukee performed better than average at 754.2 inch-pounds this time. Unfortunately, the jaw on the Milwaukee is now pretty badly bent, and it experienced a 22.4% performance drop at 585.3 inch-pounds. And 8.62 millimeters is one of the widest jaws of the lineup. And the Matco wrench performed about average on the first test, but it really struggled this time at a pretty dismal 466.4 inch-pounds. And the Matco Tools threw in the towel very early again at 420.8 inch-pounds. And the Matco Tools wrench carved out the narrowest path yet at only 7.11 millimeters. When it comes to designing a wrench, there are trade-offs when it comes to determining the metal hardness. And the very hard Proto wrench jaw broke at a very impressive 915.6 inch-pounds, the most yet. That camera is going to need some safety glasses. The The damage area on the coupling nut is 7.13 millimeters. And the $50 Matco Tools wrench really struggled in the first round of competition, and 722.9 inch-pounds isn't too impressive considering the price of the tool. And 632 inch-pounds is a 12.6% performance drop. And 7.35 millimeters is pretty narrow, but lower jaw weakness seems to be the bigger issue. And 912.8 inch-pounds is only 3 inch-pounds less than the broken Proto wrench. Very impressive! And 912 inch-pounds is quite a bit of trauma, and it did cause some damage. And 719.6 inch-pounds on the second attempt is still very impressive. And 8.38 millimeters is a wider jaw than average, and that seems to have helped. And the Proto wrench came out on top in the first attempt, but it did experience a career-ending injury. However, the snap-on finished in a close second at 912.8 inch-pounds. And the very affordable Williams performed well at 848.3 inch-pounds. Even though coupling nuts are extremely soft, all the flare nut wrenches experienced some damage or permanent stretch on the first attempt. And the snap-on flank drive combination wrench outperformed all of the flare nut wrenches on the second attempt. However, the Williams and snap-on flare nut wrenches performed almost as well at over 700 inch-pounds. Let's test the 5/8 inch wrenches next. I'll first measure the jaw gap before the test, and a 5/8 gear wrench combination wrench is nowhere to be found. So let's start off the testing with the snap-on flank drive wrench. And 1,282 inch-pounds is very impressive. Let's try this again on the undamaged part of the coupling nut. And 1,241 inch-pounds is almost as good as the first attempt. Very impressive. That's only a 3.7% performance drop. There's no visible damage to the wrench, but the snap-on did cause a lot of damage to the coupling nut. And the 5/8 Efficere delivered less than half the torque of the flank drive snap-on at only 508.5 inch-pounds on the first attempt. Unlike the half-inch size, I can't use the coupling nuts twice with the flare nut wrenches. Let's try this again with the brand new coupling nut. And 453.2 inch-pounds is a pretty poor performance. I measured the jaw gap and it grew by 0.82 millimeters. And the Duratech once again performed quite a bit better than the Efficere at 798.9 inch-pounds. With the new coupling nut on the tester, the Duratech continued to perform well at 769.5 inch-pounds. However, the jaw did expand by 0.76 millimeters. And the 5/8 inch size performance tool wrench delivered less torque than the half-inch wrench at 757.8 inch-pounds. And the super soft coupling nut only experienced significant damage on two sides. And the performance tool wrench experienced just over a 9% performance drop on the second attempt at 686.6 inch-pounds. And the jaw grew by just over a half millimeter. And the 5/8 Crescent barely outperformed the half-inch flare nut wrench at 881.9 inch-pounds. Other than some minor abrasions, only 3 sides of the coupling nut experienced damage. And the Crescent experienced a 0.3 millimeter jaw gap increase, and it lost about 150 inch-pounds of performance on the second attempt. And the Kobalt performed about as well as the Crescent at 868.4 inch-pounds on the first attempt. Just like the Crescent, 3 sides of the coupling nut experienced minor damage. And the Kobalt once again performed about the same as the Crescent at 732.9 inch-pounds on the second attempt. The jaw grew by about a half a millimeter. And Cousin Eddie says the only thing the Craftsman will loosen is the money in your wallet. Come on, Cousin Eddie, that's not nice. And the Craftsman once again trails most of the competition at 701.1 inch-pounds. Not too much damage to the coupling nut. And the Craftsman performed about the same on the second attempt at 699.2 inch-pounds. And the jaw gap grew by about a half a millimeter. And the Williams continues to outperform most of the competition at 1,103 inch-pounds. Very impressive. Looking at the damage on the coupling nut, the Williams maintained a very good grip on the coupling nut. And the Williams once again performed very well on the second attempt at 832.4 inch-pounds. The gap in the jaw did increase by 0.28 millimeters. And the Harbor Freight Quinn is here for the win, but 661.8 inch-pounds is about 600 inch-pounds short. And it's not the Quinn, but the coupling nut for the win this time. And the Quinn took it on the chin once again at only 647 inch-pounds. No visible damage to the wrench, but it did stretch by about a half a millimeter. And the GearWrench has delivered a solid middle-of-the-pack performance throughout the showdown. And it gave up at 856.4 inch-pounds. There's minor damage to 3 sides of the coupling nut. And the GearWrench held up better than average with about a 5% performance drop on the second attempt at 815.6 inch-pounds. And the Milwaukee wrench does look pretty flashy, but 776.9 inch-pounds is below average. And the super soft coupling nut seems to have won the duel, but let's replace it anyway. And the Milwaukee really struggled on the second attempt at only 566.9 inch-pounds. That's a 27% drop in performance. And the Matco Tools continues to underperform at a pretty disappointing 698.4 inch-pounds, or 100 inch-pounds less than the $4 Duratech. And the coupling nut is still in pretty good condition, but we'll throw it out anyway. And the Matco Tools dropped almost 12% on the second attempt at 615.2 inch-pounds. And the Proto wrench has more wraparound on the top side of the wrench, and it just moved into the lead at 1,305 inch-pounds. Very impressive. That's more like it. 5 out of 6 sides have damage. Obviously, it's a very well-designed wrench, and the Proto isn't just a one-shot wonder. It packed a powerful second punch at 1,270 inch-pounds. Very impressive! That's only a 2.7% drop in performance. And that's exactly what you get with a properly hardened, high-quality metal. And the Matco Tools perform well above average at 1,043 inch-pounds on the first attempt. Most sides of the coupling nut experienced a lot of damage. Just like the Proto, the Matco Tools performed well on the second attempt at 928.7 inch-pounds. And the Matco Tools definitely got the better of the coupling nut. And the snap-on flare nut wrench has performed extremely well throughout the showdown, and it continues to perform very well at 1,128 inch-pounds. Lots of damage to the coupling nut as you'd expect with over 1,000 inch-pounds of force. And the snap-on continues to impress with 950.4 inch-pounds before losing hold on the coupling nut. The Proto once again came out on top with a very impressive 1,305 inch-pounds on the first attempt. The flank drive snap-on performed almost as well at 1,282. The snap-on flare nut wrench finished in third at 1,128 inch-pounds. The finishing order for the top three wrenches remained the same for the second attempt. So which wrench set is best? At $285, the snap-on flare nut wrench set is extremely expensive, but it came out on top with an average finish of 1.71. However, for less than half the price, the Proto performed better where it counts. However, the snap-on is more compact for working in tight areas, but the Proto uses size advantage to deliver more torque. If it's all about value, the Williams is where it's at. It easily outperforms several much more expensive brands. If you're really looking to save a lot of money, the Crescent brand is a great choice. Looking at price and performance, it's hard to believe that a $16 set of wrenches outperformed a set that cost $250. I really learned a lot from these reviews. What I learned this time is that a flare nut wrench really loses its performance advantage over an open-end wrench as the fastener size increases. In other words, on a small brake line fitting, a flare nut wrench is going to be hard to beat. For sizes 5/8 and larger, it's going to be very hard to beat a good quality open-end wrench. The second thing that I've learned is that most flare nut wrenches are pretty soft and they're designed to bend instead of break when they round a fastener. There are exceptions such as the Proto and to some extent the snap-on, which are made of very hard material. If you're a tool manufacturer offering a tool warranty, opting for the softer metal will allow the wrench to bend and not break, and it'll help your business avoid warranty claims. So this makes sense. For that reason, my personal favorite this time is the Proto. I'd much rather have a wrench break instead of just bending. After all, a wrench that's bent and doesn't gain a good grip on a fastener is only going to cause damage to the fastener, and I'll end up having to use a different tool anyway. It's always nice to see when you don't have to pay a lot to get a lot, and that's the case with some of the brands. All the videos on this channel are viewer suggested, so if you have a video idea, I hope you'll take time to leave a comment. Thanks so much for watching. Please take care, and I look forward to next time.